Happy Friday, everyone. We're going to give it about one more minute before we get started. Happy Friday, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started with today's webinar. Welcome to today's webinar, Risk-Standardized Survival for In-Hospital Cardiac Arrest Reports. My name is Natalie Navarre. I'm the Senior Program Development Manager for Quality Health, Forget What the Guidelines, Resuscitation, Heart Failure, and Coronary Artery Disease. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items, excuse me, so you know how to participate in today's event. The webinar is being recorded and will be sent via email within 2 hours. You will have the opportunity to submit questions by typing them into the questions pane on the control panel. You can send in questions anytime during the presentation, and we will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. If you experience any technical issues, most can be resolved by refreshing your browser. If your issue is not resolved following a refresh, refer to the GoToWebinar customer service team, whose contact information can be found in your webinar confirmation email. And at this time, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Paul Chan. Dr. Chan is Professor of Medicine at St. Luke's Mid-America Heart Institute. He completed his undergraduate degree in chemistry and religion at Harvard. His medical degree is from Johns Hopkins, and a combined internal medicine and pediatrics residency was done at Harvard's Brigham and Women's and Boston Children's Hospital. After working on the Navajo Reservation for 4 years in Arizona, Dr. Chan completed a master's in biostatistics and an adult cardiology fellowship at the University of Michigan. Dr. Chan spends about 70% of his time conducting clinical research. He has over 300 peer-reviewed publications, is published extensively on epidemiology, outcomes, and quality of care for both in-hospital and out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. In collaboration with the AHA, Dr. Chan has helped develop the methodology to calculate risk-standardized survival rates for in-hospital cardiac arrest for hospitals participating in Get With the Guidelines resuscitation. Dr. Chan, at this point, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie, and it's a pleasure to have a chance to share with you some of the work we've been doing within the registry on in-hospital cardiac arrest and survival rates. And I'm just going to advance my slides. To start off with, I do receive funding from various entities. The disclosure that I have that is commercial is with OptumRx, where I serve as a consultant. I also receive funding from the National Institutes of Health for a lot of my research, and some funding from the American Heart Association as well. This is an overview of the 3 major objectives of the time that we'll spend together today. The first is to start off just describing why do we need to risk standardize or risk adjust survival rates for hospitals measuring and following their patients with in-hospital cardiac arrest. The second is a lot has changed in the last 3 years. With the emergence of COVID-19 onto the scene, we noticed a change in survival rates for in-hospital cardiac arrest throughout the country. And so we will share with you some of the impact of COVID-19 on in-hospital cardiac arrest survival. And finally, what that means for risk standardizing or risk adjusting in-hospital cardiac arrest survival rates at the hospital level, and how and whether or not we needed to update the model as a result of the changes that COVID-19 has imparted onto the scene. So to start off with, I'm going to address the first question of the first objective. Why do hospitals need to risk adjust and risk standardize survival rates for in-hospital cardiac arrest? Many of you know that Get With the Guidelines Resuscitation has now been with us through the American Heart Association for more than 2 decades. Initially, Get With the Guidelines was named the National Registry for CPR, NRCPR, and it was launched in 2000 and really started taking off in the middle of that first decade, with a number of hospitals joining the registry. And over the past 2 decades, it's collected over 400,000, it's probably closer to 500,000 cases of in-hospital cardiac arrest from almost 800 hospitals throughout the country. And it has really allowed investigators and researchers like myself to have a better understanding of what is going on with survival outcomes, with process of care outcomes when people have an in-hospital cardiac arrest. This was a study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2013, and we looked at the first decade of cardiac arrest survival within Get With the Guidelines Resuscitation. We looked at trends in survival in the registry. And essentially, these were the raw rates of survival over that decade from 2000 to 2009. If you focus on the blue diamonds, it includes all types of arrests, the 4 rhythms of asystole, PEA, ventricular fibrillation, and pulseless electrical activity. And we found, starting in 2000, overall rates of survival were about 13%. And in a decade's time, it had gone up to close to 18%, which is a huge increase for an outcome such as survival. When we broke it down to the shockable arrests of VF and pulseless VT, survival rates at 2000 were below 30% and rose to closer to 40% at the end of the first decade of the registry. And survival rates for non-shockable arrests of asystole and PEA rose from about 6 to 7% in 2000 to over 10% in 2009. And if we had extended this graph for another decade, from 2010 to 2019, we were seeing that the blue diamonds, the 4 rhythms, survival rates were over 20%, close to 23 to 25% each year between 2016 and 2019. And for the shockable arrests, they were approaching 45%, and the non-shockable arrests closer to 15%. So we were seeing dramatic changes and improvement in hospitals that were participating and submitting their data on patients with in-hospital cardiac arrest. Now, many of you receive or can query your own data within the online tools that Get With the Guidelines Resuscitation provides. And you can calculate your raw survival rate for all your patients within hospital cardiac arrest. However, before Get With the Guidelines started putting out the risk-standardized survival rates for in-hospital cardiac arrest, hospitals were sort of scratching their heads and trying to figure out, how do you compare my hospital with your hospital? Because our patients could be very different than your patients. They may be older or younger, they may be sicker, they may have a different combination of shockable versus non-shockable rhythms. And we know that all these things are predictors as to the likelihood of survival for each patient with an in-hospital cardiac arrest. This is a made-up scenario, and some of you may have heard this webinar before, but a hypothetical scenario of 2 hospitals with 100 in-hospital cardiac arrests. Hospital A had 30 survivors out of 100, or a 30% raw survival rate, with 1 in 5 of those patients having a shockable arrest. 20 of them were VT or VF, 80 were asystole or PEA. Hospital B, let's say, had also 100 in-hospital cardiac arrests, but they had 40 individuals survive to discharge and a 40% rate. And on the surface, it looks like Hospital B has a better or higher survival rate than Hospital A. However, their case mix, or their combination of shockable versus non-shockable rhythms, is flipped, where 4 and 5, let's say they're a cardiac hospital, were shockable, and 1 in 5 was non-shockable. So a good illustration of why we need to risk adjust or risk standardize for even this one variable of initial detectable rhythm for the arrest is if we broke down Hospital A in this hypothetical example, where 30 out of 100 patients survived a discharge, where 1 in 5 had a shockable arrest, you can see that for the shockable rate of the 20 patients with a shockable rhythm, 14 survived, or a 70% shockable survival rate. And for the 80 patients with a non-shockable rhythm, 16 survived, or a 20% raw survival rate for their non-shockable rhythms. It's still the same 30 patients out of the 100, but broken down by their rhythm. And Hospital B, as you may remember, had 80 shockable patients. And let's say 38 of them survived the discharge, or had a 48% survival rate for the shockable arrest. And 1 in 5 patients had a non-shockable rhythm, which left 2 in 20 surviving, or a 10% survival rate for the non-shockable arrest. When we break down just by this one variable, even though Hospital A had a 30% overall survival rate and Hospital B had a 40% overall survival rate, you can see for the shockable and non-shockable rhythms, Hospital A did have a higher survival rate for each type of rhythm, just by breaking it down and stratifying by the initial rhythm. And what the risk standardized survival rate does for each hospital's in-hospital cardiac arrest is it integrates differences not just in initial rhythm, but the location of the arrest, the age of patients that have arrest, whether they're on a ventilator at the time of arrest, whether or not they are requiring vasal supportive medications because of sepsis or hypotension, and their comorbidities, their pre-existing conditions, so that we can have more of an apples to apples comparison when we have one hospital survival rate versus a different hospital survival rate in the registry. And it allows us to account not just for the initial rhythm, like the example we just did in the previous slide, but multiple or all the predictors that we collect data on for Get with the Guidelines Resuscitation, what we call confounders of survival. And it includes, like I said, all these things like cardiac arrest rhythm, the location, and the illness severity of the patients that have an arrest at each hospital. It requires us to basically create a multivariable model. We don't hand calculate these, but we use statistical programs to be able to do this risk adjustment. And in 2013 and 2014, we actually published the risk standardized model for in-hospital cardiac arrest for adults. And ultimately, there were 9 key variables that played the largest role in adjustment and therefore in predicting survival for patients with in-hospital cardiac arrest. Not surprisingly, the age, the initial cardiac arrest rhythm, and the location of the arrest. And other factors included whether a patient was hypotensive, whether or not they had sepsis at the time of arrest, whether they had a metastatic or a hematological malignancy at the time of arrest, hepatic insufficiency, and whether at the time they arrested, they were on a mechanical ventilator or a continuous IV vasopressor medication, really highlighting the illness severity of the patients that are large predictors for survival outcomes. We did the same, I'm sorry this is a little fuzzy, for the pediatric population under 18. And in this case, for risk standardizing the pediatric rates for survival for each hospital for their patients within hospital cardiac arrest, we identified 13 variables, a little bit higher. And this is an example really from our first use of the risk standardization model when we looked at yearly data from Get with the Guidelines Resuscitation. We, on the y-axis, is how many hospitals there were in that year that submitted, let's say 2022 or 2019, whichever year we're talking about. How many hospitals were in each of these ranges of survival rates, less than 2% to up to 34% and higher. These are only for adults in this example. And before adjustment, you can see a lot of variability. Some hospitals have very high or very low survival rates, but it doesn't also take into account the number of cases at each hospital. And after the risk standardization, which accounts for, again, the differences in patient characteristics, illness severity, and interventions at the time of arrest, as well as the number of arrest cases submitted for that year at each hospital, we found that this distribution, a more normal bell-shaped distribution. But even after adjustment, we found on the x-axis you can see that hospitals range in risk standardized survival rate for their patients within hospital cardiac arrest from 14% to above 34%, almost a 2.5-fold variation in risk adjusted survival between one hospital versus another in the registry. And each year, Get With It guidelines since 2014 have been providing on the website access to your hospital's risk standardized survival rate for each calendar year. It's located, I think it's still in this webpage section of my reports. And when you click on the one that pertains to resuscitation, there is a PDF document that outlines the model, if you're an adult hospital, the predictors that were key in calculating the risk standardized survival rate. And it provides, and this was one of our first reports in year 2012, when we ran the analyses in 2014. It provides your hospital's risk standardized survival for that calendar year. In this case, for this site 1354, it was 19.7%. And it also provides information as to which survival quintile your hospital placed in that year among all the hospitals within Get With The Guidelines resuscitation. Quintiles are basically every 20%. It's kind of like the standardized reading and math scores that your children might come home with. And this is sort of a complicated graphic, but what we try to provide is the information, in this case for 2012, for that same site, 1354. And this little legend tells you the boundaries of each of the quintiles. So the lowest risk-adjusted survival rate that year was a little bit below 10%. The highest was 34%. The middle dark line is the median. That's the midpoint amongst the probably 200 so hospitals. The arrow provides information as to where hospital 1354 was. The first dotted line, based on the legend, is the boundary of the first quintile, meaning that 0 to 20% of hospitals were in this range. And then you can see that the middle three quintiles, 2, 3, and 4, are much more narrow because remember, the curve is normally distributed. So many more hospitals are in the middle range based on this distribution. Many more hospitals are in the middle. And then you can see the upper boundary, the highest quintile, the top 20% of hospitals' survival rates range that year in 2012 after risk adjustment from about 26% to 34%. And again, what the quintiles share is sort of the percentile ranking. If a hospital was ranked percentile 90th in the country, they would be in quintile 5. If they were ranked 45, they would be in quintile 3 or the middle. Now, over the years, we've not only provided hospitals with the risk standardized survival rate for each year, but we are able to provide hospitals that are participating year after year their risk standardized survival rate each year. These triangles, that's still how the report captures, tells you that for this hospital site 10680, how they were doing in 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, just by themselves, but then also how they place within the quintile system over those 4 years. Let me walk you through what this means. So let's say in this graphic for this site, in 2012, the risk standardized survival rate was about 25%. It went up to above 30% in 2013, was about 33% in 2014, and a little bit back down to 24% in 2015. The middle gray area is the middle three quintiles, 2, 3, and 4. So if they fall in the gray area, they're in the middle of the pack, so to speak, the middle 60% of hospitals. If they were in this white top area, it means they were in the top quintile, and if they were below the shaded area, it suggests they were in the quintile 1. So what this means is that this hospital has improved in the risk standardized survival rate from 2012 to 2014 alone by itself, and it went from the middle of the pack to quintile 5 in 2013 and 2014. There was some decrease in the risk standardized survival rate in 2015, and they were back into the sort of middle 3 quintiles during 2015. So it allows hospitals who participate every year in the registry, when they get the risk standardized survival rate report, to understand how they're doing, just comparing themselves to last year, but also how they're doing when compared to some extent to other hospitals in the registry itself. I'm going to switch over to the rationale of why risk standardization was performed for survival rates at each hospital within Get With The Guidelines, to share with you some of the research that has been done looking at the impact of COVID-19 on survival rates for in-hospital cardiac arrest in 2020. And certainly we've observed that even in 2021. We examined data at one time in 2020 compared to prior years. And this was published in JAMA Network Open at the end of 2020 or so. And we looked at hospitals and Get With The Guidelines just after COVID-19 came on the scene in March of 2020 to December 2020. And there were about 25,000 patients within hospital cardiac arrest. And about a quarter of them, 24% of them, had suspected or known COVID-19 infection at the time of the arrest. And we found that patients who had in-hospital cardiac arrest and COVID concomitantly were younger, more often men, more often a Black race, and they were sicker than non-COVID patients, not surprisingly. They were more likely to have sepsis and pneumonia, which is, again, not surprising, respiratory insufficiency, to be on pressors, and to be on a ventilator at the time of their in-hospital cardiac arrest. I'm sorry this is not blown up as well as it could be, but on the x-axis, it shows the month in 2020 for the data that we were looking at. The y-axis shows you the survival rates to discharge. The blue lines is the curve for those patients who had in-hospital cardiac arrest with COVID, and the orange lines on top of that is the in-hospital cardiac arrest survival to discharge rate in patients who did not have COVID. And what we saw was a consistently lower rate of survival to discharge among patients with in-hospital cardiac arrest and COVID, regardless of the month in which the arrest occurred in 2020. And again, that's not altogether surprising, but again, demonstrated that COVID was exerting a huge influence on in-hospital cardiac arrest survival outcomes. And when we actually made adjustments to make sure that we were comparing COVID versus non-COVID patients equally, that they were, were adjusted for things like age, which were different, their comorbidities as well. We found that ROSC rates among patients who had COVID-19, the adjusted relative risk, or the adjusted risk ratio, which if there was no difference, you would see an adjusted risk ratio of 1. That it is 0.86 suggests that patients with COVID-19 were 14%, and we get 14% by subtracting 1 minus 0.86. 14% less likely to achieve ROSC, and 35% less likely to survive to discharge. 1 minus 0.65 is 0.35, which is 35%, which is really striking. And patients with COVID were more likely to have delays in defibrillation compared to patients without COVID during that period in 2020. And keep in mind, again, the raw survival rates, unadjusted, was 24%, which was what we were seeing before 2020 in non-COVID patients within hospital cardiac arrest. And the raw survival rate for patients with COVID-19 and in hospital cardiac arrest was half of that. It was 12%. Because of that, and because we continue to see that survival rates to discharge for in-hospital cardiac arrest patients in 2021 continue to remain lower than the pre-pandemic period, we have updated the risk standardization model for in-hospital cardiac arrest for adults. And we used 2 years of data, 2020 and 2021, and get with the guidelines. We started with March of 2020 to December of 2021, and we went through the same process of redeveloping and the risk standardization model. And we compared how it performed to registry data for in-hospital cardiac arrest before COVID-19, using data from 2018 to 2019. I won't go through this in great detail, but suffice it to say that the adult model for risk standardization now has 13 variables. COVID-19 is one of the variables. SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 is one of the main variables, because we know that it has a huge influence in survival rates at this point in time when patients have an in-hospital cardiac arrest. We looked at whether or not it was important to update the risk standardization models for pediatrics, but it turns out it was not. There were only 3 to 4% of patients, kids, within hospital cardiac arrest who had COVID-19 in 2020 and 2021. And the survival rates, interestingly enough, in pediatrics were similar to patients within hospital cardiac arrest without COVID-19. And when we re-examined the model and included the COVID-19 variable in the pediatric model, it did not change. It was not a predictor of survival. So the risk standardization model for pediatrics has not changed. Only the adult model using data from 2020 and 2021. And again, this is the final model. We still have age, COVID-19, initial rhythm, hospital location, same variables of hypotension and sepsis and malignancy. Renal insufficiency now is in the model where it was before not. Hepatic insufficiency is still there. Metabolic or electrolyte abnormalities is now in the model, and trauma, and then ventilation and intravenous vasopressor. Those are the 13 variables. And this is data from the most recent year, and there were 372 hospitals. And again, after risk standardization, we see a bell-shaped curve distribution with a median rate. The mean rate, the average rate was 21%, the mean rate was 21%. And the lower quartile, meaning if you were below 18%, you were in the lower 25%. The upper quartile suggests that 25% of hospitals had risk standardized survival rates of 24% or higher in 2021. This is probably just for our statistical purposes. We do something called calibration to make sure the model calibrates or measures accurately. And it did with what we call an R-square of 0.995, which is very close to 1 or perfection, if you will. And you can see that it's supposed to be aligned with this diagonal line, and the dots of the line do. And then we looked at the performance of the new risk standardization model with the old, and it performed very well with pre-pandemic data, which suggests that the new model for adults performs just as well as it did before in the years prior to 2020. But the advantage of the new model is it allows us to risk adjust in the post-COVID era. So that's a summary of the 3 objectives I wanted to discuss today on our webinar. The first, again, to remind us, was the rationale for having a risk standardization process for hospitals' rates of survival for the patients with in-hospital cardiac arrest. The second was to share with you that COVID-19 has had an impact on, as you know, your patients with cardiac arrest in hospitals. And the third, as a consequence of that impact, we now incorporate information that is very important to ensuring the apples-to-apples comparison as we move forward in the post-COVID era in risk standardizing hospital rates, so that we can have an apples-to-apples comparison between hospitals as to how they're doing for survival rates for in-hospital cardiac arrest. So with that, I'm finished in about 35 minutes, and we have ample time for questions from the audience.
Hi, Dr. Chan. Thank you again so very much. We have a few questions in, and one of them is, she says, I have noticed a low survival rate for IHCA in individuals with a history of COVID. Is there research on the impact of COVID on future cardiopulmonary arrests?
That's interesting. We don't right now have the ability to examine that. The current registry data collection form, as you know, collects information about current or recent COVID, but we don't have information on the history of COVID. It may be something worthwhile for the people who are involved in making any changes in data collection to have that information. But at this point in time, I can't speak to whether or not that's true or not because I don't have that information. It's possible that patients who have a history of COVID-19 infection may have had sequelae, pulmonary sequelae, that may impact their illness when they do have in-hospital cardiac arrest subsequently, in their ability to, their reserves or their ability to come back from a cardiac arrest because of if they had a severe COVID episode, that there may have been scarring, or they may have underlying pulmonary sequelae that can impact their ability to recover. But it's a great research question. We just don't have the data at this point in time as it is collected to be able to address that.
Great, thank you. Someone is asking about the most current IHCA national survival rate. They did not specify if they're looking for risk standardized or not. She said, I've been told it is 13%, but that is.
Yeah, so in terms of national, I'm going to make the distinction between national and get with the guidelines national rates, because the only thing I can speak to is the survival rates from in-hospital cardiac arrest within get with the guidelines, because I don't have the ability to look at national rates across all hospitals. That is because hospitals are not obligated to report in-hospital cardiac arrest data. And so there's just no way to risk adjust. Even if we had just the raw data, we would not have the comorbidities, the pre-existing conditions. We then get with the guidelines resuscitation. I will tell you that since we help AHA run the risk standardization analyses each year, the risk standardized survival rate did increase when we first started running them in 2012 to 2015. And from 2016 to 2019, those 4 years, every year, the mean and median risk standardized survival rate across the hospitals that participated those years was either 25 or 26%. In 2020, with the huge impact of COVID, even including data from January and February where there was no COVID, the risk standardized survival rate, the average risk standardized survival rate at the hospital level was 20%. Now, it doesn't sound like a lot to go down from 25 to 26% to 20%, but that's huge. That means 20% of the survivors didn't make it because it went down by 5%. And it took us probably a good decade to get from 20% to 25%, starting from about 2010 to 2015. About 2008 to 2015. In 2021, the risk standardized survival rate across the universe of hospitals that participated was closer to 21.3%, if I recall correctly. It was 21 point something percent. And last year in 2022, it approximated 23%. So it's gradually inching back up towards what we were seeing in the pre-pandemic period of 25 to 26%, but we're not there yet. And part of that is when there's another study we've done that when hospitals were inundated with COVID patients, the survival rates not only were lower for patients with in-hospital cardiac arrest and COVID, but they actually were lower for patients with in-hospital cardiac arrest and were negative for COVID-19, but because the hospitals were swamped, response and the effectiveness of CPR could have been impacted because hospitals were stretched and the delivery of high performance CPR could have been impacted.
Absolutely. And I can share with the group the paper that came out this February that has a lot of the good COVID and RSSR data that you all published. Let me see.
Right.
The pediatric quintiles seem to change dramatically within our institution year to year with the same survival rate. Are you able to speak to this?
Yeah, that's something that we have noticed. The one thing about the pediatric community, what we've observed is in the last 4 or 5 years in particular, the range of the risk standardized survival rate is not as wide as in adults. And so small change and the challenge with the pediatric risk standardized survival rate is that a lot of hospitals don't have a lot of cases of pulseless in-hospital cardiac arrest. More than, I'm trying to go off memory, at least more than half, if not closer to 2/3 of pediatric hospitals submitting pediatric data have fewer than 5 pulseless events in a given year. And because of that, it makes it hard to have what we call stability in the estimates of risk standardization. Because as you can imagine, if you're one of the 70% of pediatric sites submitting data, and you normally are submitting literally of that 70% of hospitals, 2 to 4 events a year, one outcome change can flip a hospital from one year, from one quintile range to another. Because if you have 4 arrests, let's say the year before, and you had 1 person survive, that's a 25% survival rate unadjusted. And now you have 2 patients survive. It all of a sudden changes to something much higher at 50%. We are actually, we've submitted a proposal to try to expand the pediatric model. Right now, we do not include bradycardia events. And it turns out in peds, bradycardia events outnumber pulseless in-hospital cardiac arrest events. And if we do that, we might actually include more events for each hospital and include all the data essentially for those CPR events at each hospital and allow more stability to the estimates for pediatric sites. So we think that would be at least a starting point in terms of addressing the fact that so many pediatric sites have so few cases. And just one last thing about the pediatric calculation, that pediatric calculation is based on 2 years of data every year. Just because we only are getting about 400 to 500 pulseless pediatric events each year, each calendar year. And there are close to 100 hospitals submitting pediatric data every year. And so it's really hard to do it with 1 year. So we've been using 2 years of data, which typically has 800 to 900 pulseless events. But again, split amongst 80 to 100 hospitals, that's not a lot of events because many, it's so skewed. There are about 10, maybe 15 hospitals that have 20 or more events in the pediatric population. And those are the pediatric centers, I imagine. And then there are a number of other hospitals with much smaller numbers.
So I just want to be clear. So you said that the risk standardized report is multiple years for pediatric?
For pediatric, it's 2 years of rolling data. That's right. And
Okay.
we say that in the front page of the PDF. because it would become even less stable with 1 year of data.
Interesting. There was a question, and I apologize for misanswering this. There was a question, would it be possible to separate the data for pediatric population by year instead of combining for larger hospitals that do have more pediatric and neonate arrests? So I apologize, Heather, because I said the reports are separated by year, but it sounds like pediatric-wise, it's needing to be 2 years for the reasons specified.
I think it's something that, in terms of whether it's possible to do, it's certainly always possible to do. Does it make sense to do? I'll defer to the pediatric committee. There aren't that many hospitals with large volumes of data, but if there is interest in looking at hospitals that have, let's say, more than 20 events per year, but then we're probably only comparing between 8 to 10 hospitals. And you have the flip side of small numbers where you don't have many sites. And so what does a quintile mean? It means 2 hospitals in each quintile or something to that effect.
Gotcha, that makes sense. Let's see. Can the references for the derivation/validation of RSSS scores and factors be shared? I found the adult paper, but I'm having trouble finding the pediatric version.
Yeah, I can, if it's helpful, rather than trying to do this on air, I can share with AHA the 3 references, and they can email the attendees the reference for the initial model and the subsequent model, the updated model, as well as the reference for the pediatric model. Absolutely.
Wonderful. Someone had a question wondering if BMI had been ever included on the risk standardizer. We know that there is, we know it's not a great measurement and it has some gnarly history, but just wondering if that was something that was taken into account.
The answer is no, and maybe that's related to pediatrics, but certainly in the adult population, it's not, because we don't have the information to calculate BMI in terms of the fact that there is missing data to calculate. So not every patient has BMI. And we did a BMI paper like 15 years ago, and I forget what percentage of patients we could calculate BMI, but it was probably missing in 40 to 50% of patients. The problem when we have missing data is if you try to run a model with a variable with any missing data, patients missing data on that variable will drop out of the analysis. So if you had 100 patients in your hospital and we could calculate BMI for 30 patients, if the model was run on your hospital, only 30 patients would count, the ones with BMI, and the 70 that don't, they drop out. And so it's not a good reflection of your performance if there's bias as to who gets the BMI collected and who doesn't. And there probably would be if, let's say, the ICU is more attentive in entering, collecting that information than entering it. I don't know. And pediatrics, there are probably different ways of thinking about how BMI plays out across the 4 age groups of neonates and infants, young children and older children, and it adds complexity to what is considered normal or not normal. And can you compare a BMI of a neonate who may be a preemie to an adolescent? So for those reasons, we have not really looked at BMI as a predictor.
All right. A site says they have a considerable population with aortic aneurysm rupture and or repair, such as TAVR. Many have not had an MI. Asking about properly coding these patients, which I realize is maybe not exactly for this forum, but would you like to address it?
Yeah, we certainly, when we developed the model, we considered the illness category. That the problem with the illness category, as you can imagine, is it's very broad. The illness category being things like, are you a medical surgical or medical non-surgical patient? Are you cardiac surgical and cardiac non-surgical? Those 4 main components or categories. It doesn't get at the nuances of maybe some hospitals taking care of more patients in the, let's say, the TAVR section, if they have a large TAVR program and for some reason they have a large number of cardiac arrests for the TAVR patients in their hospital. We wouldn't be able to account for that because we don't collect detailed information on the universe of potential surgical procedures or medical diagnoses. And the reason is, of course, your abstractors will thank us to not have that many variables. Already, the data collection form, I'm told, is at least 200, if not 250 variables for every patient. And if we expand it on all the potential myriad of surgical and procedural and also comorbidity diagnoses, it would just be too burdensome for data entry.
Absolutely. I will back that up as well. I wanted to address quickly, as far as the pediatric population goes, I'm going to take this opportunity to really put in a plug for our data collection for newly born, neonates, and pediatric. The more data we can get, the more we can be revising our guidelines. It's a very circular, iterative process, and so I highly encourage any sites that have pediatric populations that code to be entering those data. And our QI consultants are very well versed in the forms. They're in most cases identical to the adult form. So, so if you have pediatric cases, please start entering them and let us know if you have any questions about it. I believe there is one more question. One site says, our data are not publishable because we use manual data entry without inter-rater reliability. This is several questions. We do have several sites that don't use inter-rater reliability, just as an FYI. She asked if the data you're using have been audited in any way.
Can you repeat that last sentence, Natalie?
I think she's wondering about auditing of data before you run the results.
Yeah. Currently, Get With The Guidelines does not audit data. There was a period of time in the early years of the registry when I started joining the leadership of the Get With The Guidelines Resuscitation in about 2007. They had just completed an audit, and it was, I forget how many hospitals and how many cases at each hospital, but it was very labor intensive to do so. And as you can imagine, somebody auditing would be going through the chart, either paper chart at that time or in this era, EMR. But the challenges of privacy and IRB approvals at each site become extremely onerous. Now, the question is, are sites obligated to audit their own data? Certainly when a site comes on, there's a training program to ensure fidelity of data entry by each site's abstractors or abstractor. Those individuals can move on to new jobs, and I imagine that there is training as to the new person, but there is no easy way to systematically audit either a random handful of cases from every site. And it does raise, I think, underlying the question of our data is only as good as each hospital is honest with their own data, because we cannot police or monitor the fidelity of submissions. At the same time, I think it provides, since Get With The Guidelines is a QI registry, you want to submit as honestly as you can all your data so that you can have a full picture of how your hospital is performing, because that's the whole point of the registry data to begin with, to accurately understand how things are going with regards to resuscitation processes of care or outcomes for your own institution.
Yes, and we do have a program that has just been kind of rolled out, where we have a dedicated team looking at helping certain hospitals that are concerned about inter-rater reliability or wanting to check the quality of their abstraction. We don't have that rolled out for all modules yet. It's still it's still being piloted in a couple of other registries, but we look forward to offering that for resuscitation as well. My last question, I know I said the last one was last, but this is really the last one. You mentioned at one point stratification or looking at size of hospitals or volume. Can you speak to that?
Good. That's a good question. When we send the American Heart Association Get With The Guidelines every year, the risk standardized survival rates, what we do is basically, we run the model, we calculate them for all the hospitals, but we also provide data as to whether or not the risk standardized survival rate differed by whether it was an academic hospital that was a major teaching hospital or a minor teaching hospital or a non-academic hospital. We provide information about whether or not it differed by how many beds the hospital had, like less than 250, 250 to 499, 500 or more, by the geographic location by U.S. Census region. And we can certainly do it by other stratifications. The data that AHA receives, they can also create stratification if folks if there is interest to look at other types of strata. I imagine what the person is asking is, can that be included in the report? Can that risk standardized survival quintile be provided for hospitals in the South versus the Northeast, or a large size hospital versus a small? And the answer is yes, it can be. And you could conceivably see an overall number, let's say 400 hospitals for 2023 this year, how your hospital ranked. But then if they were to take the subset of hospitals that were your size, they could potentially look at the, let's say instead of 400, the 150 hospitals, and you already have the risk standardized survival rate. You can then reallocate the quintiles or the quartiles or the tertiles and see how you fall ranking wise as a hospital within hospitals of your size or of your geographic location. You don't want to start cutting it too thinly. You don't want to have a stratum of hospitals that are 250 beds or to 450 beds in the Northeast that are academic, because then the numbers get smaller and smaller. But you can do that. Any combination thereof can be done. I defer to the AHA as to whether or not they want to do that, but the answer is the risk standardized survival rates don't change if they want to take cuts of hospital strata, and it can certainly be provided in different ways that suit the needs of sites.
That's great to know. Okay, I think we have finished with our questions, and we are so grateful again, Dr. Chan. Do you have any closing words before I close us out?
Two things. I'll email as soon as I get off the call the references. And I would, the AHA and the Get With The Guidelines committee is considering strongly about an award for survival, as well as the longstanding awards for process of care measures. And I know that there is interest in highlighting hospitals that also have not only good processes for resuscitation, but high survival rates. And I think that would be an exciting way of really, again, incentivizing us to think about how do we do the work we do, the passion that we bring to the table, but also celebrate when we have success.
Absolutely, very, very well said. Yes, that is something that we are considering, and we hope to have some finalization on that to come. All right, well, thank you everyone so much for attending. When you leave the webinar, you'll get an email with a short survey. We'd appreciate it if you complete that so that we can get your feedback. And there will be a follow-up email within about 2 hours with a link to view the recording of today's webinar. We will get you the paper that Dr. Chan mentioned, or his references. Thank you so much for joining us and for your commitment to the AHA and Get With The Guidelines. Please have a wonderful Friday.